Kyle is going to be taking a little look at trust across cultures and hurdles to those trusting relationships. So, Kyle, if you want to hit share, I shall relinquish the stage and I shall pass it across to you.
I shall. I think let me just try this over again here.
That's okay. It's all good. We'll let you pick the correct screen. It's always high risk at this point in time. It's all great.
It is. Well, I'm getting a different interface here. Oh, here we go. I know it. Here we go.
Fantastic.
Okay.
Cool.
Good.
Perfect. Okay. There we go. Excellent. Over to you, Kyle.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for inviting me. For all those who don't know me, I'm Kyle Pearce. I'm the VP of Community Integration for Inspire Resources. And I'm coming to you this morning from the traditional and unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. I want to show one slide that just shows our worldview at Inspire. We're a startup in the mining space that envisions mining as a sustainable industry, that is one that produces critical minerals to fuel an economy that will sustain human life on Earth, and one that leaves communities and ecosystems positively affected for the long term. And one of our contentious views, you can see here, is putting remote and Indigenous communities at the center of global sustainable economy, because the critical minerals we need originate there. So I'd like today to take us on a mining expedition of a different type. And instead of digging into the ground to learn about where critical minerals are and how we get them, we'll dive into what we're learning about how we form trust. I spend a lot of time thinking about trust because much of my career has been spent bringing people together to collaborate on projects. And usually, as we know, there's some level of mistrust in the room. So in this brief time, I'll explore three aspects of trust that I think we need to consider for mining. First, I'll share research about how trust forms in our brains and what can inhibit us and others from determining who is trustworthy. I'll talk about the legal framework within which we work and how that can be a constant threat to trust and what we can do about it. And then I'll share some thoughts and a new initiative that we feel will help us to improve our own trustworthiness as miners. So let's talk about what's happening inside of us when we feel we trust another person. One thing we know about trust is that there's an element of speed to trust. It takes about 30 milliseconds to decide if a person's face is trustworthy, according to the Journal of Neuroscience. We determine whether or not we trust someone in the amygdala, a part of the brain that was formed to help us make instantaneous decisions that could determine whether we live or die. These are the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses that saved us from saber-toothed tigers at one point in time in our evolution and are still with us today. So does that mean we really only have one chance, known as a first impression, to establish trust? Well, the answer is no. While the amygdala has a role in creating that hot mess of emotions that can tell us when we're in danger or that we don't trust someone, it also has complex interactions with the parts of our brain that remember whether or not a person has proven trustworthy in the past. A 2021 study looking at the dynamics of trust formation used a game where people played against two computer-simulated opponents, one who would play the game in a trustworthy way and the other in an untrustworthy way. The game was played when the participant was in an MRI, so they could see what parts of the brain were engaged during which phase of the game. After playing the game, the participants told the researchers which player could be trusted or not. And they also described the more trustworthy player as significantly more fair and more intelligent than the untrustworthy player. So here are three big findings for us to consider. First, the amygdala plays a key role in our fast fear response and in our assessment of trustworthiness. Trustworthy people stimulate more parts of the amygdala more intensively than untrustworthy people do. There's also a slower learning process that involves pattern making, which takes inputs from multiple parts of the amygdala. These parts interact with the rational part of our brain to remember whether or not a person was trustworthy in the past. The parts of our amygdala complex are involved in a bunch of things. One is processing outcomes from another person's behavior, assessing the affective value of another person, i.e., how we feel about them, accumulating information about past behavior to discriminate between trustworthy and untrustworthy people. And it also arouses our bodies to alert ourselves to the threat of betrayal that comes from trusting another person. And I want to comment on Catherine's discussion of the dark side of trust. And I think you said, Catherine, provocatively, that Trump builds trust among his constituents. And so in some ways, when we look at the fight, flight, fear response in the amygdala and the trust determination in the amygdala, in many ways it makes sense, because many of Trump's supporters they trust him because he articulates the fears that they have about progressive change. Interestingly, the researchers also found that some participants in the study were less able to differentiate between trustworthiness and untrustworthiness of their opponent. While this happens naturally when a part of the amygdala complex is damaged, other factors in assessing trustworthiness that we need to think about when we're in these relationships is, early relationship quality, including anxious and insecure attachment, the absence or presence of positive experience where we learn that we can trust others, the extent to which there is open communication and we feel that it's open, the consistent behavior that we perceive in the other, and of course, emotional safety. So when we look at all the factors that can inhibit trusting relationships, we can see that many are present when mining companies engage with communities. I want to draw attention to how these mining relationships happen within a context that undermines the ability of companies to build trusting relationships with Indigenous communities in Canada in particular. So in British Columbia, the Mineral Tenure Act is being challenged by the Gitxaala First Nation, which argues that mining claims in its unceded traditional territories, which are not covered by treaties, should only be made by people and companies who have engaged the First Nations leaders. In the province of Ontario, 10 First Nations in Treaty 9 are taking the government to court for $95 billion over repeated violations of their treaty rights, and in particular, their ability to make decisions about how mining happens in their treaty territories. They're arguing that the treaty signed was never shown to Indigenous signatories, and they never gave up jurisdiction over the protection of the land and waters. And their goal is to co-manage and co-regulate resource development. Okay, I've got a tricky part here, and I'm going to stop screen sharing, and I'm going to screen share on something else.
Doing a great job, Kyle.
Well, thank you. We'll see if this works, and I'll have to come back here too. Okay, can everybody see this?
We can, yeah.
Okay.
Ability to care for their lands forever. You can't care for your land.
Sorry,
case. Here, they were already encroaching on lands that belonged to the nations, the peoples who were here. The Crown, in this case, the two crowns, Ontario and Canada, those governments, conspired by themselves behind closed doors as to what the written text of the treaty was going to say. They brought that written text in their pockets to talk to the leaders of the First Nations in Treaty 9 territory. They never showed them the text. They did not leave it with them. They did not describe some of the words in the written text. The written text says, in words inserted by the Crown governments, you all hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up everything. No nation in their right mind is ever going to agree to that. These nations did not. They couldn't, in accordance with their own laws, which provide that they have a sacred responsibility to care for their lands forever.
Okay. Okay, so wow, that makes it really difficult to enter to earn the trust of First Nations communities when you're starting out with that. So, historically, many mining companies approach First Nations with the genuine intention of doing good. But the legal framework within which the relationships are built is asymmetrical. Knowing what we know about the process, about how we process trust, it creates a major problem. A company may feel like they are acting consistently and in alignment with the laws and regulations, but their First Nations partners may have a completely different understanding of the legitimacy of those laws and regulations. So consistent behavior on behalf of a mining company can actually lead to less trust rather than more. And I also want to highlight, something Ron said, which is that when we're working with First Nations communities, especially who have traditional harvesting practices, a threat to their environment is not a threat to their profitability of their company. It's an existential threat, and not the first of many in Canada. Okay, so how can mining companies build trust knowing all this? Well, Inspire Resources has developed a framework called community integration, and I'll just draw attention to a few of the elements. First of all, earlier engagement. We've seen that the amygdala produces trust responses over a period of time. So for the longer the relationship, the greater the chance of building a trusting relationship. Secondly, know ourselves and our relationships. So prepare by engagement by understanding ourselves, including our negative biases, the protocols and history of the community, and the impacts of legislative and regulatory framework on the people with whom we're going to engage. Expand the relationship to address the holistic needs and plans for the community, not just those that are crucial for our business success. So by learning and understanding the wider needs of communities, we can help communities and community members find their pathways to healing and greater trust. And finally, build partnerships, not impact benefit agreements. A partnership approach calls us to have more open communication and be more vulnerable with communities and First Nations. Now, with the adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's the acronym UNDRIP here, the tide is turning, it seems, towards a veto power, an effective veto power for First Nations in Canada. Inspire is currently exploring the feasibility of a new entity that'll monitor and evaluate changes in the landscape within which mining companies engage with communities. The goals for the entity include reducing risk by helping companies understand and adapt to changes that have not been defined as of yet, in partnership with Indigenous experts to adopt practices that will result in trusting relationships and successful projects, and to build capacity, dialogue, and collaboration across industry, investors, government, and First Nations. So while miners can't make legislation move any faster, we can get out in front of the issue by treating Indigenous communities as equals and as true collaborators in mining operations and in the long-term future of these communities. That means being conscious of the unconscious ways that trust develops and being ready to walk the path of reconciliation. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Kyle, thank you so much for that. And actually, as well, showing that video, because whilst your prose was beautiful, actually feeling that power with regards to what was happening in that situation, I can still feel the emotion inside me at the moment. Now, I have one question for you, because I don't want to run out of time today, because we have a fabulous last speaker as well. So Cecilia, you're up next. But Kyle, with regards to the experiment that was done with the MRI scans, when you said that one person was the trustworthy and one person was the untrustworthy, who won the game?
So first of all, a disclaimer, I'm not actually a neuroscientist. So my explanatory abilities on the details are limited, but the game was a cooperative game. So both could win. And I don't know if you looked at you can kind of figure out the rules from the illustration, but if you give 5 points to your opponent, it triples it. So the opponent gets 15. If the opponent gives 10 back, then they have 5 more than they began with, and you have 5 more than you began with. So it's a collaborative and cooperative game where both people can win, just like mining, no?
I like it. At least we didn't find that the untrustworthy person won after all of that, because that would have been very sad. But Kyle, thank you so much for that. Absolutely brilliant. Round of applause. Fantastic.